So, traditional Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. To understand.
Atheist and
That's Alan.
Why? Are you answering that?
No, I'm getting your water because it is out of your reach.
Thank you so much. I don't know how to warm open this episode. Soft open?
Well, after many months about talking about books that people really liked, now we have a bunch of books that people didn't like.
No. At least they weren't burnt.
I mean, some of them were.
On this episode of
The Holy Watermelon Podcast.
I like that. It leaves people in suspense.
Right?
Yeah. So as Preston mentioned in the soft opening, we're talking about books.
Soft opening.
Is that not what it's called?
It is, but it just hit me wrong this time. That's all.
Get your brain out of the gutter, my friend. The sex episode was months ago.
Yeah, it was.
Man, this episode we're going to talk about books that were not included in the holy books.
Yeah, we got abandoned books, genuinely lost books, books that have been deliberately destroyed and made harder to obtain, and books that maybe didn't actually exist.
Maybe didn't exist. And then we have some books that were found.
Yeah.
We'll wrap up the episode with that. So,
yeah. And this is a pretty good way to end our mini-series on books.
Yeah. So, let's get started. I'll say a lot of this is Judeo-Christian, but we did throw some others in there.
As much as we could.
Yeah.
I think.
Okay. Take it away, Preston, with your biblical apocrypha.
Yeah, let's start with something that's at least vaguely familiar.
Yes, we did touch on this in our previous episodes.
Yeah. So, the Greek Jewish Alexandrian Apocrypha, I like to call it that because our number one source for this material is the Egyptian Septuagint. These works get to enjoy a secondary scripture status in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, but they're really pretty much just ignored among Jewish congregations. Even things that cover material like Maccabees talks about Hanukkah and gives the Hanukkah story. It gets a little bit of attention, but a lot of rabbinical literature on the same subject actually will get a lot more attention depending on which groups you talk to. So generally speaking, this Apocrypha is only popular with Christians, even though they are not the authors of this material.
Yeah, it's all Old Testament stuff or Jewish stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they like it.
But there is another collection of Jewish Apocrypha that includes more than 20 works that didn't make it into the Alexandrian Apocrypha.
Oh, cool.
Most of them survive in Coptic, Greek, or Old Slavonic. There's a handful of others from other more spread out groups, but it's a decent list. And some of these are kind of interesting. The Book of Jubilees is a really interesting book that expands on the tales of the people of the Genesis narrative. It names the women of the story.
Nice. Not just the men begatting more men.
Yeah. Because, biologically it takes more than just a man.
Unless.
No, I got no unless.
Mary.
Okay. But that's, still more than just a man.
Fair.
I don't think it's a great exception.
That's okay. Fair.
So we hear a lot of ridiculous memes out there, like if Adam and Eve only had their sons Cain, Abel, and Seth, who did they make children with? And people jump to the conclusion, obviously their mom. Okay, one, fully ridiculous and strictly forbidden in the biblical text, and just gross.
Right? Then we'd all have messed up jaws.
Who knows? So the Book of Jubilees actually names the sisters that they ended up marrying.
Cain and Abel had sex with their sisters. Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah. Imagine any other scenario in a world of such a limited population.
You know what? I'm going to have to show you a video when we hop off this call. I've actually invited him onto the podcast. We'll see if he says yes, but he's a biblical scholar. Mm-hmm. and he does amazing reels, and he talks about Cain being kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and he finds people.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's like this double narrative of like, there's people out there, just not in the Garden of Eden.
Right. If you want to make the story of Genesis feature real people while also focusing on, or even admitting the reality of the vast historic record we have of the ancientness of the human species, I think it requires an interpretation of Genesis being more as Adam is the first human that God made a covenant with. And if you want to avoid really terrible inbreeding for several generations, you do kind of need another set of people outside of this garden.
Yeah, I'll find this video for you when we're done. And maybe Dan will listen to this episode when it airs and say, yes, I'll be on the Holy Watermelon podcast.
That'd be great. The Book of Jubilees doesn't like this particular explanation we've just talked about. It's very much Cain, Abel, and Seth married their sisters. Well, which is more or less the same situation you have after the Noah flood story,
too. That way it was abandoned.
No, it's abandoned because it's not considered authoritative.
Fair.
It's a story book that just expands on pre-existing stories with an awful lot of conjecture. I think it's also really cool. It gives specific dates for events, and the calendar system. It's called the Book of Jubilees because of how the years are counted. That there's weeks of years being a system of 7 years.
Right.
And then every 7 weeks is the Jubilee. It's not super clear in the text if we're talking about the Jubilee being the 49th year or the 50th year. And there is a little bit of argument on that.
Sorry, you said every 7 weeks is a Jubilee. You mean every 7 years is a Jubilee?
7 weeks of years.
Oh, my head hurts.
It's the language they use. It is a little funky.
Okay, my head hurts.
Because it's not the way we talk about years.
Right.
7 years doesn't mean anything.
Seven times 7.
But
49 or 50.
If the fundamentalists who were really serious about living a biblical government and biblical life in North America, if these fundamentalists actually knew what they were talking about and were serious about doing it.
Every 7 years, debt gets wiped away.
Exactly. I like that you know exactly where I was going.
I do know. Because we all have debt that would like to be wiped away.
Sure. And, all of these companies that are super predatory about debt might be a lot more careful about who they lend money to. And that's fine, too.
I like it. Carry on.
So this Jewish Apocrypha that's separate from the Alexandrian Apocrypha popular with Christians also includes several apocalypses attributed to biblical patriarchs.
Can you remind me what apocalypse actually means? Because I was reading this, I was like, I know it doesn't mean.
Right. Apocalypse does not mean the end of the world. Right. It means revelation.
Thank you.
So we've got a lot of patriarchs in the Hebrew Bible that get special status just because of their relationship in the family line. Mostly when we talk about this to either Adam, Enoch, Noah, or Abraham. And somebody wrote up some prophecies to attribute to them.
Okay, no, that's a good reminder for both me and probably our listeners, since it's been a while since we talked about apocalypses.
It has been a little while, yeah. So it's an interesting collection of material, but nobody who's really concerned with building a scriptural canon has ever considered them authentic or authoritative. So there's that.
Cool beans.
Another one that I found interesting on this great collection is a Testament of Job.
Ooh, sad Job.
So we know that the book of Job that we have in the canon of the Hebrew Bible is a philosophical story meant to just talk about ideas. There's nothing in it that tells us it's a true story. But,
no.
But a lot of people have jumped out as saying, oh yeah, no, this is a real person who is a really important figure in history. And the people who wrote the Testament of Job decided, oh yeah, we're going to really build up this really great story to explain why he's important. And so they made him a king in Egypt. They also tell this tale of how Satan tortured Job for destroying a non-Jewish temple. That's the cause for all of this suffering. That it's not just, hey, God, you want to see if this guy's going to stay faithful? No, it's I'm going to torture him because he is making idol worship difficult. So this is a different look at the story.
Interesting.
And I mean, this is definitely much later from the bulk of the biblical texts as far as a writing goes. But it's also really interesting that it's one of the earliest depictions of Satan as an actual villain, the way Christians tend to see him.
No. We also have Christian pseudepigraphic writings.
Oh,
thank you.
Well done.
Thank you. Because that was so hard last time I had to say it. Pseudepigraphic. Make up a huge collection of rejected books. But because they are ascribed to apostles who were definitely dead before they were circulated, and because they vary from accepted theology, they don't count.
Yeah, they just didn't make it into the cut.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we've talked about this before. A lot of the New Testament really focuses on Christianity really close to Greece and Rome.
Yeah.
And it's a bummer because apostles went everywhere. And yay, the power of imperialism. Just worry about the dudes who did the missionary work really close to the core of the empire.
Yeah. I mean, it would be interesting to see what went out further.
And maybe it's because they were so far away from the core of the empire, it's hard to really authenticate. I don't know. That could be part of the problem. But there are letters and sermons and whatnot attributed to most of the other apostles out there. It's entirely possible a lot of these are forgeries. Yeah. It's possible all of them are forgeries. It's too difficult.
Right? It's too old, man. Why weren't there record keepers back then? Like better record keepers. I know there were record keepers.
Yeah, it's tricky business.
The pseudepigraphic writings are often called New Testament Apocrypha. We've talked about the Infancy Gospel before.
Oh yeah,
I love these.
The absolute lack of information on anything about Jesus' youth made it a very popular topic of discussion.
Yep, so they were popular for a while, often conjecturing on what the life of Jesus was like before he began his public ministry at the age of 30. There are also several summaries of the Jesus ministry that didn't make it into the canon and have been preserved in various collections.
Yeah, there's a lot of Gospels.
It's the good news, my friend.
Yeah, that's what the word means.
Not for Jesus.
Some of these stories are really wild. And some of these Gospels that we get in fragments. The Edgerton Gospel, it's got just 4 fragments of stories. It's called Edgerton because we don't know who wrote it, who got it, where it came from, so it's named for where it's held, basically. We do that with a lot of manuscripts. And it's got 3 stories that we're familiar with from the canonical Gospels, and then one other miracle on the River Jordan that isn't recorded anywhere else.
Huh.
It's kind of nifty.
That is cool.
And so we've got a lot of fragments and a handful of books and a handful of names of books that other authorities have said, yep, we're aware of this book. It's no good. And that's how we know it existed, but it's gone.
And we'll get into those a little bit.
Yeah.
There's also several shorter Gospels, as Preston mentioned, that focus only on the last days of Jesus' life or only on his death and resurrection. And these are called Passion Gospels.
Yeah, some of them are interesting. There's the Gospel of Peter that just talks about the very end of the whole deal and the resurrection. And some of the words feel a little bit weird, almost like it was poorly translated from another language or maybe poorly transcribed, and they screwed up some of the spellings of words to change adjectives from nouns and whatnot. It's kind of funky, nifty to read. But there's plenty of extra New Testament type material that is available that we don't have publicly preached from pulpits. But it's interesting.
It is, and my brain's going now, and I feel like I'm about to delve into a topic that should be for another episode. But like, how does that affect faith?
I've spoken even recently to people who are really uncomfortable with the idea that there are books that say something different from what the church says, and what do you do with that? And the easy answer is
it's non-canonical.
Yeah, there's a reason it was left out, and generally that reason is because it wasn't considered authoritative. Part of the measure of whether or not it was authoritative was, does it jive with what we've been teaching?
Yeah.
So
Because I guess if it's as legitimate as any other, right? Written around the same time, written by an apostle, then yeah, it's an interesting thought exercise.
Yeah. And nothing is ever as simple as you want it to be.
Right?
So to add to this list of abandoned scriptures, some of which for very good reason. Well, I think we mentioned a little bit about something that was abandoned with the Mormon Church.
Would we call it abandoned?
I would say so.
Okay.
The first major chunk of the Book of Mormon translation process, often called the Book of Lehi, even though it's not just the Book of Lehi, there's other content as well, was just abandoned after the manuscript from the translation process was stolen or was allowed to go missing.
Stolen by Lucy Harris, probably.
That's generally what people say. The inclination that I get is that she was showing it to somebody else and then it went missing. And so somebody probably stole it from Lucy. But it definitely was allowed to go missing because Lucy was hounding her husband, Martin.
Yes.
Who was acting as scribe for this whole project. Mm-hmm. So a bad time. There was arguments. Yeah. There was definitely some shouting.
Yeah.
And Joseph was worried that if they started over, somebody would edit the stolen manuscript to show that the translation process was a hoax. So they just abandoned that whole chunk of text and moved on. Because so many people want to know what's in it, an awful lot of people have published forgeries, and you can find them if you go looking for them. There's a handful of them on Amazon. They haven't sparked my curiosity enough to go after them. But there are a few people who have not published forgeries or any sort of material other than saying, yeah, I've got it. And I'm curious if they're just waiting for the church to publish something or what the deal is. I'm sure they're not even interested in what they see on Amazon. If they're looking to see if there's differences, they're definitely waiting for the church to publish something.
Interesting. This made me think of the Netflix show Murder Among Mormons. Mm-hmm. Very good. Highly recommend it. The person, he's a real person, Mark Hoffman, he did a whole bunch of LDS forgeries building up to the lost 116 pages. He never actually got that far before he murdered a whole bunch of people and went to jail. But he's actually considered one of the best forgers in the world. Like, it took highly specialized people who had enough doubt to find it.
It's good to have people with doubt.
Because even the church was like, yeah, even carbon dating was coming up as accurate. They have no.
Well, if you can get your hands on some really good old papyrus, they're sometimes easy enough to clean up that you can write what you want on them again, which is a hell of a task. Sometimes these things are really brittle. But I mean, it's a cool job.
His talent is remarkable, and then he murdered a whole bunch of people, so that's cool.
Yeah.
Highly recommend watching it, though. But anyway, that made me think of that, but no, he never actually got to the 116 pages, but he planned on it.
I bet. If you're getting away with a lot of really good forgeries.
He did. He also did regular, Americana, George Washington and Founding Fathers forgeries as well.
Sure.
But he was a Mormon, so he did a lot of Mormon stuff.
That makes sense.
I digress. That's not what this episode's about, but maybe we'll do
But it is interesting.
Maybe we'll do a movie night or something.
Ooh.
Watch them. Anyway.
All right.
Moving forward.
For those people who, I'm sure that we've talked about this before, there are a lot of people who believe the Bible is perfect. A lot of them insist that the King James Version is the best version of the Bible. There is no good defense for that claim, but here we are.
You look so sad, audience.
So there are an awful lot of books that are referenced in the Bible that are not present in the Bible.
In the Bible.
And so we call these lost books because we know they existed based on somebody referring to them as their source material, which is nice. Not all of the authors who were dealing with the history in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible material referred to where they were getting their information, but some of them did, and I think that's really cool. The chronicler, the one who wrote the Chronicles, did often cite its sources, and just a couple of authors did the same. Or maybe it's the same editor who worked in these other books too. Don't know. Too far back in history.
Always cite your sources.
That is the best practice. That helps
people 2,000 plus years later.
Yeah. So good historians will cite their sources.
And the chronicler was.
Yeah. And so in the history books of the Hebrew Bible, Numbers refers to the book of the wars of the Lord. I'm glad that the wars are really quite summarized in the Torah. Joshua and Samuel both refer to the book of Jasher. There are forgeries of this book that you can buy. There's no reason to believe they're authentic. It's just somebody cashing in on the idea that they can sell you this book that you might be after because you heard somebody mention it once.
We heard Samuel mention it. That's pretty authoritative. Gosh, Preston.
And the book of the Acts of Solomon is also cited in 1 Kings 11. And prophetic books also get mentioned. The chronicler talks about the book of Samuel the seer, the book of Gad the seer, and the book of Nathan the prophet. These three in particular might not actually be lost. They might be condensed into what we now call the book of Samuel, or maybe they were condensed into a previous version of the book of Samuel. Hard to say. There's a lot of guesses and hypotheses, but it could be true, might not, don't know. The chronicler also cites the prophecy of Ahiah, the visions of Iddo the seer, the book of Shemaiah, the book of Yehu, and the sayings of the seers. So these are all books that are cited in the Bible that I would say are pretty solid proof that the Bible is not a complete or definitive collection of all of the Word of God that a lot of fundamentalists will tell you it is.
Because there's stuff missing.
Yeah.
But it was divinely inspired what belonged in it, Preston. Remember all those quotes we read last episode?
The table of contents was decided by a committee of people.
Oh.
And people are imperfect, often devastatingly so.
The New Testament as well could certainly have included a lot more letters, and included letters refer to several other letters that didn't make the cut. So just like the chronicler, lots of these letters mention other things.
Oh, yeah, a lot of the time you'll see in the New Testament, Paul will say, I've told you this before.
Remember that last letter I sent you guys?
Yeah.
How come you still aren't doing what I say?
Yeah, and he'll describe what's in the letter, and it doesn't match the content that we have in the New Testament, meaning it is also incomplete.
Yes. Yeah, so there's an earlier letter from Paul to the Corinthians, which is in 1 Corinthians 5. There's another letter to the Corinthians between the canonical first and second, called the Letter of Tears or the Severe Letter. That sounds...
Yeah. Just from the mention that we have in 2 Corinthians, that's all we can say.
That's all we know.
He says he was harsh.
Does he apologize?
Paul's not much of an apologizer.
I can. Some scholars think it's lost. Other states included the canonical second letter as chapters 10 through 13.
Yeah, hard to say, because he gets a little harsh again. Maybe, maybe not.
There's an earlier letter to the church in Ephesus, in Ephesus 3:3. There's an epistle to the church at Laodicea in Colossians 4.
Mm-hmm.
There's a letter printed in several collections that might be this letter, but most scholars seem to think it's just a forgery. There's a short letter from the Apostle Jude, not Iscariot, including references to material in one of the books of Enoch, not present in the Bible.
Yeah, there's a lot of material that claims to be the writings of Enoch. And it's hard to say for sure if he picked something that's really authentic, but it jived enough with Christian theology that he stuck with it. And, the Gospel of Matthew refers to a prophecy that Jesus would be a Nazarene or Nazarite, hard to say for sure. It's interpreted in Matthew as referring to him being from Nazareth, which scholars have since found that there was definitely not a town by that name when Jesus was born.
Right.
But this prophecy is not preserved in the Hebrew Bible or in any surviving text. There are a couple of passages in the Hebrew Bible that may potentially, depending on your personal requirements for proof, count as
sketchy.
An allusion that may look like a prophecy. The arguments here are pretty weak. Generally, it's a lot easier to say, you know what, it's just not in the Bible. But some people insist that the Bible is perfect, and so they make weird arguments.
All right. Moving away from our Judeo-Christian
A little bit.
world.
Yeah.
A little bit.
A little bit. Manichaeism does have a little bit of Christian flavor in it. But it's...
Is it the body of Christ? Sorry. I'm sorry. That was bad. I'm bad.
The religion seems to be a composite of Judaism, well, Christo-Judaism, Buddhism, and
Zoroastrianism.
But also there's some Neoplatonic ideas that are incorporated, which feels a little bit weird because Persia definitely wasn't super friendly to the Greeks, but ideas travel. So
A good idea is a good idea.
right? So I think it's really interesting. Mani is the dude for this religion.
The JC of Manichism. Manichaeism.
Manichaeism. And he wrote a lot of books. Most of them are lost. And so I want to talk about a couple of these that we have an idea of what's in them. So the Arjang is the first on this list. And the book exists today in fragments of translations.
Oh, no. That's not very good.
It's definitely a hard position to start from when you want to create a finished text.
Yep.
But I think it's interesting anyway. We do know some of what's in it. The title means worthy, but the book is also known as the Book of Pictures because it's a picture book. It's got lots of diagrams.
Cool, I love that.
So many diagrams.
Love that.
Pretty great. Most religious texts don't really lean heavily on pictures. I guess, there's the Brick Bible and the Action Bible.
I love the Brick Bible. I should reread it now that I have a better understanding of the Bible.
Sure.
I read it when I was homesick one day. Have I ever told you this story?
Probably, maybe.
I read it when I was homesick one day, and I had a horrifying fever dream about Lego Bible. There were just so many little foreskins. It's horrifying because the Bible's pretty. Lots of battles.
Right.
There's lots going on.
Yeah.
Lots of people dying. Lots of foreskins getting cut off, and then little Lego pieces, and then having a fever dream on top of that.
And these foreskins are the same piece of Lego that is money in the Lego video games.
I know. Yes. If you haven't read the Brick Testament, that's what's used for foreskins. Sorry, I interrupted. Picture books.
Yeah. The book was originally written in Syriac, according to what I've been able to find anyway. And it was pretty popular because Mani's theology was a combination of the teachings of Zoroaster, Buddha, Jesus, and Neoplatonic ideas, or at least Neoplatonic adjacent ideas. You find that Manichaeism gets talked about most in discussions of Gnosticism, which, if you remember from our interview with Dr. Glenn Farron, a lot of the discussion around Gnosticism is a little problematic. But it's interesting anyway. We will have to spend some time digging deeper on the show on that subject.
Just on Gnosticism, yeah.
Yeah. There is a record from about 1092 CE, so almost a full 1,000 years ago, almost, that indicates that the library in Ghazni had a copy of this book. In modern Afghanistan is where this is. Manichaeism seems like it probably still exists in the world today, but a lot of writers will say that it's gone. I find it a lot easier to believe that it's still around and these people are hiding. And there's some pretty good evidence of that, especially in China.
Even Neo-Manichaeism, right?
Sure.
When we talked about all our air quotes,
there's loads
dead
of revivals.
religions. Well, none of them actually are anymore, thanks to the internet.
Yeah. Yeah, the internet is really great for revival religions.
Mm-hmm.
What a interesting, what's the word I'm looking for? Phenomenon. An interesting phenomenon.
Do, 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 do. I know they say phenomena, but
Yes. I've gotten that a lot with the word phenomenon.
do, 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 do.
Another Manichaean book that we know even more about is the Book of Mysteries or the Book of Secrets. And a Muslim scholar named Abu al-Faraj Muhammad ibn Ishaq al-Nadim.
Well done. That is a long name.
It is such a long name. He lived in the 900s of the Common Era. He gave us a list of chapter titles for this book, which is unfortunately all we've got. But I think it's kind of interesting. I want to go through these chapter titles.
Okay, I'm ready. I'm here for it.
All right. So the first chapter is an account of the Daysonites, generally considered to refer to the Gnosticism of Pakistan, which was not terribly friendly with Manichaeism.
Fair.
And certainly not friendly in Islam. But we get an account of what these guys teach. The second chapter is Hystaspes' Testimony of the Beloved. Hystaspes was a Zoroastrian king who was converted to Zoroastrianism, and Mani might use this kind of apocalyptic literature to explain himself and his theology.
Okay.
Yeah. The third, keeping track of things is hard sometimes.
I'll count for you.
Perfect.
With my fingers so nobody can see.
Thanks. The third is Jacob's words about the soul. I'm not entirely sure who this Jacob is. Clearly, I have more reading to do. But it is figured that Mani might quote the words about the angel Jacob in Joseph's prayer in this chapter to support his foundation myth.
Okay.
The fourth chapter is called The Widow's Son, which might be interesting for Freemasons who talk a lot about the widow's son.
Oh.
But we honestly have no idea what this material is.
What
we
is
just have
the widow's
chapter
son
heading.
in Masonry? That's not the right word.
In Freemasonry, the main mythological character is this fella named Hiram, who was the son of a widow. And in the Masonic myth, he dies to preserve the secret of his labor.
Okay, cool. Yeah. I literally wanted to say Hiram McDaniels, the five-headed dragon. As soon as you said Hiram, I was like, McDaniels.
That's more appropriate in that John the Baptist talk.
Yes.
Check out our episode on holy relics.
And join our Discord to see actual holy relics they took pictures of.
Mm-hmm. Fifth, we have the words of Jesus about his soul preached by Judas.
Interesting.
Yeah. Because we don't have this material, we can only guess, but Mani might be quoting the record in the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Judas, both of which were not terribly popular for quite a long time. I think the Gospel of Judas is a fairly recent discovery even. That's how well it was buried. Who knows what we would have had in this chapter. Sixth, we have the beginning of witness after the victory of the righteous.
That's a bit of a mouthful.
It is, a long chapter heading. The righteous is suggested by some scholars to potentially be a fellow named Enoch, and this chapter might be related to the Book of Enoch. Hard to say if they're expecting to be the biblical Enoch. I don't know what they're expecting here. Seven spirits tells of the incarnation of the dark power associated with the seven stars.
Ooh.
These seven stars are very likely the planets that move.
Would they have been able to see all seven, though?
Well, so we got Mercury, Venus,
Mars.
the Moon, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn.
Okay.
That's seven.
Can you see them?
Can you see them? Yeah. Uranus is a fairly recent discovery. Neptune.
And Pluto. Downgraded.
Yeah. So I feel like that's likely what our seven is.
Okay. Thank you.
Because those are the ones that people get really excited about when they talk about astrology. Is
right.
Those seven.
The Sailor Scouts. Duh.
Exactly.
I'm a millennial.
The four spirits tells of the incarnation of the dark power associated with the four seasons.
This is chapter 8.
Yes. I stopped using numbers, didn't I?
Yep.
Okay.
That's fine. I got you.
Number 9 is just called mockery.
Ooh.
And this probably describes the ridicule that Mani suffered by various cultists and other people who were confused about why he would be talking about these things. The word I heard in one summary was the bewildered.
Oh, I like that.
the next one, are we on 10? All right. The 10th chapter is Adam's testimony about Jesus.
So like the Adam.
Right.
Okay.
Which really, what's the word I'm looking for?
Doesn't make sense chronologically?
I mean, it does if Jesus is important and Adam was a prophet. Then prophecies.
So right. As opposed to just, okay.
I mean, you to buy into this chapter, you've already bought into a lot of things.
Fair.
A lot of things that you, Katie, have not yet bought into.
That sounds like you're trying to evangelize me. That's crossing a line, Preston. Now's when you pull out your book of choice.
Fair, yeah.
And you say, have you heard about our Lord and Savior?
Yeah. So this Adam's testimony about Jesus quotes from Adam's revelation to show the prophetic inheritance from Adam to Jesus to make Jesus look good, which is easy to buy into if you already think Jesus looks good. And I don't know if it really works well the other way around. I think it bolsters testimony rather than creates new testimony.
Right.
Then that feels a little weird, but okay. The 11th chapter is resistance from the fall of religion. So basically, how to keep the faith, I think, is the main principle here. The 12th chapter is doctrine of the Dacianites on the soul and the body. Ooh. So talking about what these people believe, which is important because the next chapter, chapter 13, is refutation of the Dacianites on the living soul.
Okay.
Which is the number one clue that I had picked up on earlier when I said these people don't like the Dacianites.
Okay.
Chapter 14 is the three ways or three trenches. And it talks about the creation of the universe and three plagues that trap dark demons.
Ooh.
Which could be very useful if you're worried about demons.
That sounds like a Buffy the Vampire Slayer episode.
It does, doesn't it?
I like that.
All right, chapter 15 is the construction and maintenance of the universe. The story of the world created by net wind, which I don't really know what to do with that title. But
all right. Remember, this is Lost. We can't know anything about it.
Yeah, we've just got these chapter headings and, in some cases, brief descriptions. Chapter 16 is called 3 Days and explains a really interesting phenomenon in theory about 3 bright days and 2 perfectly dark nights.
Oh.
I'm curious. I want to know more.
I do too. This sounds like a great book.
Right? Chapter 17 is called The Prophets, which is an interesting choice of title because this whole book is actually, well, not whole book, this whole chapter is satire about false prophets and astrologers and their purported miracles.
Okay.
And then the last chapter, chapter 18, is called The Last Judgment, and it foretells the scene at the Last Judgment Day.
Because all religions foretell of that, basically.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
If you want people to behave a certain way, an element of divine judgment gets talked about, I think, probably every time.
Yeah. You can't scare them in this lifetime. Let's scare them for the next.
Sure. Yeah.
There's also the purpose of Jainism. And we haven't talked about Jainism at all, but it's on our list.
Yeah.
It's what we would consider an Eastern religion.
Yeah.
As much as Preston and I love that label.
Yeah,
so
feels weird.
The 14 purvas are listed as general headings in the Jain's Agama Sutras, but the texts themselves are lost.
Yeah. I have feelings about this, but let's keep going.
Oh, no, jump in with your feelings and then I'll list the 14 titles that we have.
No, I'll come to it afterwards.
Okay, so we have the 14, here are the 14 purvas. So we have the Utpad Purva, which is living and non-living.
Just everything that fits in these
Everything
categories.
that's living and non-living. That's a long list.
It is.
We have the Agrayaniya Purva, the 9 realities and 6 substances.
So I admit I haven't looked into the the philosophy of the elements from this particular religious position. But that's what I'm expecting these six substances to be, is a slightly expanded idea of the elements from what you'll see
fire,
in China
water,
or Greece. Yeah.
We have the Virya Pravada Purva. So this is relating to energy of the soul and of the non-living. We have the Asti Nasti Pravada Purva.
I love this name.
I know.
I know that I don't know what it means, and that's part of why I'm attracted to the feeling that comes from this title of the Asti Nasti. One day I'll know what it means, and it'll be so much easier for me to feel the solemnity that comes with it.
Not the silliness. And it's the multiplicity of views, which I like that as a chapter.
Right.
We have the Jnana Pravada Purva, and this is the 5 types of knowledge and 3 types of ignorance. I want to know what those are.
5 types of knowledge. We've talked about knowledge before and how belief really works and why it's kind of tricky and problem causing. I don't know if I've got 5 types of knowledge.
I don't know. I guess we'll
have to look into that.
You will just have to bump Jainism up the list.
Yeah.
We have the Satya Pravada Purva, which is speech, truth, resistance, speech, truth, restraint, and silence.
Knowing when to speak and when not to, I think, is a thing that a lot of people could do a lot better at.
Yep. We have the Atma Pravada Purva, different points of view on the soul.
I really like they accept and will look at different facets.
Yeah, it sounds like a well-rounded religion. Mm-hmm. We have the Karma Pravada Purva. Karma, how it ties you down, how to get rid of it. I imagine that's heavily influenced from neighboring religions.
Yeah.
We have the Pratyahyana Purva, which is giving up, restraint, vows, and attachment.
So, you got to give up your attachments to this world. I was going to say this is probably
like a nirvana piece.
Yeah.
We have the Vidya Pravada Purva, which is expertise, exceptional abilities, and how to achieve them.
And I'll give you a hint. If you want to be an expert at something or a master of something, detachment is not how you got there.
The next one we have is the Kalyana Pravada Purva, which is spiritual alertness and laziness. Number 12 is Prana Pravada Purva, which is 10 types of vitalities. 13 is Kriya Visala Purva, skills. 64 arts of women and 84 arts of men.
Because men are better at things.
Wow, get out of the studio immediately.
Gender roles are an ancient problem.
Yes. And then we have the Lokvindas Purva, 3 parts of the universe, including heavens and hells, and also math. Well, if there's math in heaven, then I don't want to be right.
Yeah. So now that we've gone through the facts that we have available.
And you had a problem with some of this.
So it is said that the first Purva, the one that's on the subject of living and non-living things, took as much ink as would be displaced by an elephant. So we're talking about 6 cubic meters, roughly.
That's a lot.
That is a lot of ink.
That's like $600 worth of dirt per yard.
Sure.
I bought some cubic yards of dirt not that long ago.
So that's a lot of ink for a thing that purports to be a book. And the second Purva, about realities and substances, took twice as much ink. And this doubling continues with every Purva through to the last.
So what is 2 to the 14th?
So I actually sat down with a calculator, and with more than 16,000 elephants.
What?
Because that's how doubling numbers over and over again works.
It's called exponents, kids.
Exponential growth gets problematic real quick.
Unless it's your money.
Then it's a wonderful thing, as long as it's your money and not your debt. So if an elephant's volume is about 6 cubic meters, and we're talking more than 16,000 elephants by the time we get to the 14th Purva, that's just under 100,000 cubic meters of ink.
That's a lot.
Even if you completely coat every page with ink, which you'll see, if it's really artsy and every part that's not black ink is gold ink or blue or red or whatever, that's still a
lot of ink.
Huge collection of texts. And the idea is that these books that claim to have been lost, that are really hard to believe that they ever existed, would have included all of the combined knowledge of the universe, which would have also been embodied in a handful of what they called omniscient teachers. I feel weird about calling any teacher omniscient, but here we are. It's a fairly common claim for a lot of religions to believe that their great teachers literally knew everything.
Nobody knows everything, kids.
No, nobody knows everything.
Except me. I think this podcast has proven that I do not know very much. Mostly how to pronounce words that I've only ever read.
You did a great job pronouncing a lot of these Perva titles.
Thank you for recognizing that. I was a little stressed out when I opted to read that part. I was like, what have I signed up for? So thank you.
I think you did well.
Thank you. Moving on to destroyed books. So we've lost books. Some books never existed.
Some have been abandoned.
Now ones that have actually been destroyed because of their contents.
Yeah.
So we'll start with Christian books. Some books we only know about from the letters between early church fathers, and many of them are now, many of them are only noted as being heretical.
Yeah, a lot of them we don't have much for details. It's just like, yep, and this gospel according to Harry was trash.
Garbage. File that under G. Do you think someone in the year 300 said file that under G?
I doubt it.
Okay.
But one can hope.
The Book of Nepos, written by an Egyptian bishop named Nepos, explained that there was no allegory in the Bible, only literal truths.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting that Eusebius, when writing about this book, didn't have much to say about it other than this way of thinking is too Jewish.
I think it's funny, and not that there's anything wrong with too Jewish, but like this was deemed heretical, who knows when. And now, in the year 2023,
fundamentalists are going hard.
A lot of people are like, it is the literal truth.
Yeah.
Anyway. Then, of course, we have the Gospel of Eve, mentioned in an essay by Epiphanius.
Yeah.
I did it! In the 4th century CE. He didn't like that people were using it to validate free love, saying that the body is naturally extremely sinful, so they should acknowledge it by having lots of indiscriminate sex.
It's a weird position for a Christian to hold.
I know, that's why I had to read that twice.
I mean, most of the human species is way into sex. And most of us are happy to make excuses to have more of it. And with more people, I guess. Well, I don't know if that's fair to say. An awful lot of people. I don't know if it's the majority.
This next one just made me gag.
Yeah, so I'll keep going for you.
Thank you.
The Gospel of Eve seems to also justify eating semen as a spiritual sacrificial act. Weird choice.
Not my first choice, but...
A lot of other churches more recently have said, no, doing that, terrible sin. I feel like that's a hard swing in the opposite direction that wasn't entirely necessary, but...
Let's just say it's your personal preference.
Right.
And if consent is involved, have fun. But let's not advocate for it either way. How about that?
I think that's the right choice.
Thank you.
Also, due to this whole indiscriminate sex thing, the pull-out method is super important to the people who wrote the Gospel of Eve.
Okay, fair.
So we only have this little summary from Epiphanius. I'm worried that Epiphanius left out some material that may have been influential to people who, like we mentioned earlier, believed that Eve had sex with her sons. I'm uncomfortable with it. Mm-hmm. it's probably best the book didn't survive.
Hot take from Preston today.
We get what we get.
I love it. Other destroyed books.
I don't think we ever even really mentioned the people of ancient Mexico.
One day we're going to have to. We should make sure it's on the list.
Yeah. The original Mexican codices were burned by a fellow named Tlacaelel after he helped Itzcoatl take power in the new Aztec Triple Alliance. It was really important to him to really make sure everybody bought into the new imperial motif, and that involved getting rid of a lot of things that existed before. He loved burning books to help people forget things that would remind people that there was ever anything before this new Triple Alliance. And then, of course, the Aztecs had a tricky relationship with the conquistadors, too, as did pretty much everybody the conquistadors met. Like the Hebrew Bible, these codices of the Aztecs, the Mexicans, they would have likely included theological essays as well as histories and also land survey data.
Oh, cool.
Which I feel like you glossed right over the land survey data in the Hebrew Bible. Most of us did. This guy also really loved human sacrifice and helped make it more common. Human sacrifice was never as common as a lot of what we see in popular media, but this guy says, no, you guys aren't doing it nearly enough.
It happened, and it was because of Tlacaelel.
I mean, not exclusively, but definitely mostly, I would say.
He's a big fan of it.
Yeah. So, unfortunately, most Aztec, Inca, and Mayan books were burned by Catholic priests who came with the conquistadors. Some survive in private collections, not much.
That's too bad. My favorite story of all time. It's just a wild ride. We're switching gears one more time. We've talked about things that are thrown out, lost, abandoned, destroyed. Now we're going to talk about things that have been found.
So we tried to abandon them. We hid them, sometimes for protective purposes. But now they're found.
This is my favorite story of all time. Is the Nag Hammadi Library. The first time I heard the story was when I was reading Elaine Pagel's book on the Gnostic Gospels. And honestly, her intro in this book is so good. I wish I could have done it justice, because you're like, I'm going to read a religious studies book. And then it's like, double murder. And you're like, what? What's going on?
Spoiler.
I know. So to backtrack, spoiler alert, there's 2 murders. So the Nag Hammadi Library was discovered in Egypt in 1945 by 2 men that were digging for fertilizer in this area. It's called Nag Hammadi.
Now, I'll admit, I don't know a lot about agriculture, but do you dig for fertilizer, or do you just scoop it off the top from where your livestock
I think
wander?
it depends on what you're... Because if you have a whole bunch of stuff like... I think of like peat in Ireland, right?
Okay, fair.
I don't know what the landscape of Egypt is like, but...
I mean, from the pictures I've seen, it's
pretty sandy.
Yeah.
You probably do. Anyway.
Maybe.
They were digging for stuff in Egypt, let's just say.
Okay.
And they came across a large urn that was sealed shut. And honestly, the guy was like concerned whether to open it or not, because he was scared there was a djinn in it, because
they talk about that, yeah.
But then he also thought there might be money in it. And so his greed overcame his fear of a djinn. And so when the urn was broken open, it was filled with papyruses bound into codices.
Man, that'd be disappointing.
And actually, he was. Yeah, like literally the man. This is my next sentence. The man, Muhammad Ali al-Saman, who found the documents, was disappointed that the jar did not contain gold. And he ripped up some of the papyruses, these codices, to share with the other men present. This is where the story gets really fucking wild, though. So Muhammad's father was murdered after this incident, around this incident, separate from the finding here.
Okay.
And so he and his brother decided to avenge their father's death by committing a murder. And so they were worried that the police, because it's 1945, like they were worried that the police investigation would come to their home and find these books that, like, they knew that these were old things and that they should not have them. So they decided to burn them
Dicks.
I know. And so ultimately, we'll never know what the contents of those papyri were, which makes me really sad because imagine what they could contain.
Right.
After that, some of the texts were sold on the black market until they garnered enough attention to be confiscated and sent to the Coptic Museum in Cairo.
So they didn't burn everything.
They didn't burn everything, but they burned some of it, which makes me so sad.
For sure.
We are left with 13 codices and some extra papers. Codex 12 is mostly burnt, though. I got some charred remains.
I mean, these... As much as I'm glad that they're inept, I'm disappointed that they're so inept.
Wait, what do you mean? Like, you're sad that they burned them?
I'm sad that they burnt them.
Yeah.
But also, it's sad to see somebody so inept.
Yeah, instead of being like, holy shit, and then like calling a museum immediately.
I mean, every stage of this is ineptitude after ineptitude.
Yeah, like double murder. Yeah, the double murder.
But even just the plan, oh no, somebody's going to find these books in our house, better burn them. And they didn't burn everything they found, which is a good thing, but also an embarrassing thing for them.
Yes, and also like, if you're wanted for murder, I think the last thing they're going to be worried about is books.
Well, so this is in the heat of the time of finding ancient things is a really big deal.
That's true. We're just like digging up Egypt. Period.
Yeah, and so basically this counts as like stealing from the government. Yeah, which is always a big deal.
Anyway, so, you're right. Ineptitude, start to finish. The Nag Hammadi Library is now what we call the Gnostic Gospels, and these Gospels are written in mostly Coptic. The most well-known is the Gospel of Thomas, which is different from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And this Gospel is mostly sayings from Jesus, and many of them align with what is currently found in the New Testament. There are some that aren't, but lots are.
Yeah, calling it Gnostic, well, calling anything Gnostic has proven to be tricky. This particular text is one of the less Gnostic.
Yeah, it's pretty standard with what?
Pretty much.
Some of the other ones, though. So it also includes the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Adam, the Gospel of the Egyptians, the Gospel of Philip, and many, many more. The texts are believed to have been written in the 4th century CE and to have been considered heretical. And they were hidden to escape the destruction that we saw with the other books.
Hide things, and maybe they'll stick around.
And they mostly did until they were found by Muhammad Ali al-Saman, who then burnt them.
Yeah. Dick.
It's just like, what if there was like proof? You know?
I mean, a testimony simply doesn't qualify as proof.
I know. Because we have enough testimonies and we still don't.
Yeah.
But, like, I just want to know what was in them.
Right.
Stupid man.
Oh, wow. even the idea that in this book is the coordinates where we buried something that is proof. That's a thing people talk about sometimes, but it's not ever
right, like the Ark
fruitful.
of the Covenant or the Holy Grail.
Other found books. We've got the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Very popular. Better known than the Nag Hammadi Library. Less cool of a story because no double murder.
Yeah. I mean, an awful lot of it is the same material people are familiar with, but there's more to it, and I think that's really cool.
Yes, there's a lot to the Dead Sea Scrolls.
So they are Jewish manuscripts that were found in the Qumran caves on the shores of the Dead Sea. They date earlier than the Nag Hammadi Library, which makes sense. Nag Hammadi stuff's mostly Christian, and though Judaism does persist, this particular phenomenon is pre-Christian, with maybe some overlap with Christians in the timeline. But this material is not Christian, despite what some writers will try to convince you. Mm-hmm. Mostly these writings are from the 3rd century BCE to 1st century CE, early part of that century. They are the oldest surviving manuscripts of the entire books that are part of the biblical canon. And there's also some Deuterocanonical content.
I love that word.
Right. For those of you who forget, the Deuterocanonical scriptures are the apocryphal books of the Bible that are actually in the label, the Apocrypha. as opposed to everything else that's apocryphal and not part of any canon. So there were a lot of pieces of papyrus found around the Dead Sea. Some of them are just tiny, tiny scraps. There's still a handful of universities with people who were just committed to the Jigsaw Puzzle Project.
Yeah, I even found that they're still finding bits.
Yeah.
So, but the main discovery process took about a decade. Again, kind of the same, found around the same time as Nag Hammadi.
Yeah.
In the kind of span of that, I think 30s to 40s.
Yeah. Well, and the discovery process was a kid was out with his goats and just found jars with books in a cave.
And there's multiple caves along the Dead Sea. And there's a really great website. It's literally, I forget what it is. I think I put it in the notes. I said there's a Dead Sea Scroll digital library. I will put in the show notes. And you can literally go through the Dead Sea Scrolls piece by piece, and it'll tell you what cave it was found in. And sometimes it'll give you content. Sometimes it's just in a different language. And you can just look at the piece of paper and go, wow, that's a piece of paper I can't read.
Right. I love that this kid with his goats just found these things in caves that have been open for centuries, because these are found really quite recently. Part of the story that we'll see a little bit through history is that the Dead Sea, as just the lowest point in the whole world, is actually has this weird connection to the underworld, and that if you want to get to hell, you go in those caves, which of course nobody wants to do. So you don't do. So just some
either 10-year-old who was ballsy or didn't know any better.
Basically the deal. Yeah.
I like that. We're not going to go over the content because it's predominantly the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, most of it is the Hebrew Bible. There are a handful of local government type documents, like how you need to live when you're part of our community kind of deal. That's about it. Not terribly special.
Yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls digital library actually breaks it down really, really well by sections. So biblical, non-biblical. They have a legal section, and then Psalms and Genesis have their own sections, I imagine, because they found
so many copies.
So many of those. So that's really cool.
And the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is, special just because it's the oldest that we've got. It's kind of cool.
Yeah. The texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls are in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic.
I think it's interesting that Greek made the cut. Like, Hebrew makes perfect sense. Aramaic makes perfect sense as basically the common language of the people in that area. But the people that had isolated themselves from Jerusalem and from the other neighboring cities so effectively, I don't imagine they would have been terribly interested in Greek, but Greek's there.
Well, and just recently in March 2021, which is very recently in the grand scheme of when these were written, archaeologists discovered dozens of fragments written in Greek. Yeah. So they're still adding to the Dead Sea Scrolls collection.
Yeah. Well, there's so much to go through yet.
Yeah. That's a project you need to get on. You've already done so much translation work.
Right.
And they clearly need bodies.
It's a massive jigsaw puzzle project that
you like puzzles?
So many people are involved with. I do.
And
I don't
Greek
know if I could handle the tedium that this job really is.
I feel like you'd have to have a really good grasp of the languages to even know what goes together.
You do, for sure. And while I have studied 2 of these 3 languages in university, I would not say my grasp of them is so strong that I would be able to do this task quickly and efficiently.
Fair. I feel like it'd be really hard to find an Aramaic scholar. Because that's a dead language, isn't it?
Strictly speaking, Hebrew is a dead language. And the revival that we see of Hebrew is imperfect at best. So, yeah.
Okay. All right.
So the real question is, why aren't these books revered
because
by
it wants
anybody?
us to eat semen. That's a good reason.
That's a good reason for one specific example on this whole list.
Well, the notes say because the devotees lost the war against imperialism. I mean,
when one group says you need to accept these books and get rid of everything you ever believed before, for example, the things that happened in Mexico and Central and South America, Yeah, imperialism is definitely the driving force between a lot of these things being abandoned and destroyed and lost. Not all of them, but definitely a lot.
Yeah, and I mean, this kind of even goes back to our Dead Religion series last year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Christianity swept across the world, and so we lost Norse religion and Celtic religion and Egyptian religion, and they probably had holy books too.
We haven't found any evidence that the Norse and Celts really relied a lot on writing for their religion, but the Egyptians definitely wrote down a lot of their stuff. So, yeah, for sure. And of course, we talked about how some of these books were simply rejected just because they weren't authoritative.
And in some cases, a little bit ridiculous.
Yes.
Infancy Gospel being one of them.
Oh, the Infancy Gospels are so fun, and they really give you a different Jesus than the one we got in the Gospels.
Dead. Alive. And then, yeah, I mean, Preston also mentioned, like, if you're trying to make a cohesive belief system, and some stuff's gotta go. And if you're in power, you're gonna cut out what you don't like and what doesn't work for your
anything
empire.
That undermines your authority.
Yeah. Then it's gonna get cut.
Yeah. And specifically when we talk about the purvas of Jainism, I think it's really interesting. This book doesn't really seem to have been a thing.
Right.
But it's talked about as though there's this one literal physical manifestation of all of the world's knowledge. And then the last guy to have it told the next guy who was in the middle of getting it, don't share this anymore. And he just went along with it.
I mean, he probably went, it's hard to share because there's like 14,000 books here for all this ink. Right. I can't even share it if I wanted to. This was our Lost and Found episode. We love your support. We want to grow this podcast. Share this with a friend if you enjoyed it. Leave us an Apple review. That increases our reach exponentially, 2 to the 14th exponent. So that would be awesome. If you can join us on social, Discord, Instagram, Facebook, stay up to date on all sorts of stuff. And of course, we can use some financial support to keep this podcast going.
We've got our shop where you can buy t-shirts, mugs, bandanas for dogs, or
baby
cats.
bibs in some instances.
All the things that you would expect.
All the things. If you want to give us a little bit of money ongoing, we have our Patreon as well. So we have bonus content, early release, and we also have a separate tier for our book club. So if you want to read some of these religious studies books that we dig into on our own time, read them along with us. We would love your support.
Thanks for joining us.
Peace be with you.
By the late Middle Ages, the Christian prophecy had fulfilled itself.